Okay, I got requested a couple days ago. First of all, I'm Carl Churchill, well, obviously, but I got requested a couple days ago. We'll post a map for the 30-day map challenge to do a quick workflow video. I think this request came through by Michael Storzum, who's a very talented archaeologist that I know on Twitter, and he asked it for a quick workflow video of how I design terrain. So I thought I would do that for today's theme, November 24th, which is elevation. And then I also got a request from Prajwal Pandey. I hope I said that right. To do a map of Nepal. So obviously, I thought it's just perfect timing to do a relief map of part of the Himalayas. Just really straightforward terrain work through. So that's what this video is going to be. Pretty rough. Hopefully, you can get something interesting out of it. I'm just kind of I haven't made the map ahead of time. I've prepared all the data, but I'm just gonna run through it, and you'll kind of see my mental process as I develop things. So first of all, the area that we're going to be covering is Kanchenjunga, which is a mountain in far eastern in Taplazung district in Nepal, on the border of Nepal and Sikkim, India, with a little bit of Tibet. And I really thought about whether or not I should do part of the Himalayas for Nepal because it's what I think everybody does for Nepal. But because I wanted to do a map that was really a classical relief, it seemed appropriate. But I have to try and be a little bit unique, so I definitely wasn't going to do like Everest or K2 or any of that. Um, so it already is prepared. I got the DEM from a dataset called NASA DEM, which is kind of the successor to SRTM, if any of you are familiar with it. I already prepared it and exported everything outside of ArcGIS Pro. I also pulled in an imagery mosaic that I downloaded off Google Earth Engine and just some minor water bodies. There's not many water bodies in the area visible at on this scale, but I included them anyways. So if we go to the Photoshop file, you see that I've already set everything up. I really like labeling features in their native language if it's practical and feasible. Um, but obviously, I don't speak Nepali, Tibetan, or Limbu, which is a local language in the area. So I relied on some mountaineering websites for that, which are very helpful. And after this video ends, when I post the map, I'll try to remember to post a link to where I found that, and hopefully the labels are formatted properly. It was a bit of a challenge finding the font for Tibetan, but I think it worked out all right. So yeah, we are going to get started. I already have everything exported. I like to take everything and export them as TIFF files at normally 300 to 500 dpi and just stack them. This is the standard use Photoshop template that I use. And yeah, let's get going. So I always want to capture both the macro and the micro features in the landscape. Yeah. To do that, I tend to start with the DEM, or I'll start with the hill shade. So one of my biggest, most powerful tools is the equalize tool, which basically stretches out the entire histogram of values in the TIFF file. And it's really, really useful for giving you basically as much as the data can offer and helping you see those really, really big features. So what I notice here is there's a big lobes down here. Let me draw this in so I can highlight it. There's a big lobe down the middle here. There's some features here, and generally there's a large curve here. So I want to make sure that these are all relatively visible in the final map, as well as each individual little, valley. Yeah. So another tool I use is the median tool, and if any of you are familiar with the work of like Bernhard Jenny, Tom Patterson, you'll know that there's tools out there to average DEMs and hillshades, and they're a very powerful way of getting a macro view of a landscape, because a computer obviously can't infer that for you. You kind of have to guide it along. That's one of the downsides of a digital hill shading versus traditional. So I'll use the median tool to start pulling out these larger features. I think we'll do it again, and I'll enhance it again. And then this is good, but I don't like that it gets darker and lighter, which is not what I want. So I'm going to high pass it and end up with something like this. This is a really good bird's eye view of the big features in the landscape. So if we go to our hill shade, this is just a standard Esri hill shade, nothing special to it. Drop this in. You can already see the big things start to pop out. And if we pick our level tool, we do some minor tweaking and lightening. Hill shades should always be lighter than you think they should be. So I'm constantly lightening hill shades as I go along. We can start to get an idea of the larger impression of the landscape. So I'm going to do this a second time, except I'm going to do it with a hill shade now. That's nice. I'm going to blur it. And I'm going to drop it down again. And now it really starts to pop out. Like this. There's a bit too much detail in this hill shade still, and it's not particularly pleasant detail. So I'm just going to smooth it a couple times. I tend to use the medium tool. Just at one, just to quickly clean up a lot of it and blur it again. It's always better for a map to be a little bit blurry than a little bit sharp, and it's kind of counterintuitive, but I found that it looks smoother, it actually looks crisper when it's blurrier than when it's sharper, because the sharpening algorithms tend to add nasty little artifacts that catch your eye in a pretty unpleasant way. So I like where this is going already, but I still don't like some of these really dark shadows, and I want to give a lot of room for textures to come in later. But this is good. This is already something workable. So the next step varies. It's pretty freeform. What I might do is something a little bit... Actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the slope raster. This is just a standard slope raster calculated from the TIFF file, but I inverted it so areas of high slope are darker than areas of low slope. This is how it normally looks. A bit too messy, so I'll blend it, blur it again, and then here's what's nifty. If you drop it in, just on multiply, you get something like this, which is just gorgeous already. It's still a bit too messy, so I'm going to blur it and run that a couple more times. And I think I'm going to tamp it down. But I really, really like these glacial contours, so I'm going to high pass it. High passing is a great way to get the shapes without getting the values in a raster. Now, if you equalize it, you'll get something like this, which is basically 100% outline and nothing else. Sorry if I keep clicking to OBS. I don't record videos often, so I'm very paranoid about them, but anyways. And this is already looking great. Now, this is a great first step for detail, but it's too detailed, and the detail hides a lot of the landforms that we want to keep visible. So this is where I'm going to introduce a concept that's really, really crucial if you want to make a good hill shade, which is masking. And if you're not familiar with masking, it's just feeding a grayscale raster into another raster or any other layer in Photoshop to tell it where to be more or less opaque. So you can do that with basically anything, but I very often do it with DEMs or slope rasters. If you mask with the DEM, normally higher elevation areas will show up more and lower ones will be less opaque, while with a slope, steeper areas will show up less and flatter areas will show up more, which is a great way of targeting flat areas to pull out detail without blasting out kind of these mountain sides. But here I think I want to Just gonna take my slope raster. I'm not sure what I want to do exactly. I'm not sure which part of it I like more, so we'll just try both. So this is with the slope raster. So steeper areas are being masked more. Flat ones it's showing through. Equalize it. It's even more extreme. Let's flip it and see what happens. So the first one, this one, I think is better as a foundation. This one is a bit more final. Like if I was putting on the last touches, it gives a nice craggy, rocky feeling, but it's far too blurry to be very appealing. So I'm going to flip it back and keep it like this and keep moving. I'm going to blur both. And you know, this is almost like painting. You want to really work methodically and slowly and not be too dramatic with anything. Right now I like it, but the higher, there's no sense that like Kanchenjunga is this massive mountain towering over kind of these foothills here, because there's no sense of gradation associated with elevation or steepness. So that can be fixed a number of ways. I accidentally deleted my hill shade. I'll just drop it back in. One of my favorite ways is to take your hill shade, your original hill shade, equalize it, brighten it a bit, darken those shadows, really blast it out, and take it, mask it with your DEM, and boom. You get those really sharp, crisp edges as you go up in elevation, and it kind of blends in as you get lower. But it's still a bit too much. That's nice. But now I'm going to go to my blending modes, and I'm going to actually use the screen tool. That makes it lighter. Now, if you're following any of the principles of Swiss-style shaded relief, like the ones put out by like Edward Imhoff, I think that's how you say his name, and others, you'll know that you actually want kind of both ends of the map to be light. You want both lowland and highland areas to be light, but you still want them distinguished, and often you want the really, really high areas to be pretty bright. But this is too bright to the point where it's obscuring some detail. So I'm just going to back it down a bit, but still already, it's a subtle difference, but it absolutely helps those upper areas just peek out a little bit more, and I can equalize my DEM, something like this, and make it more extreme. So I think we're at the point where we can start adding in my personal favorites, which are the curvature rasters. These are a big part of what I think is kind of my quote-unquote look. And they kind of capture, I'm not very good at explaining it, so apologies, they kind of capture heterogeneity in a landscape in different dimensions. So there's three. There's three that ArcGIS Pro generates. There's curvature, there's profile curvature, and there's plane curvature. And curvature is kind of both dimensions equally. Profile tends to accentuate horizontal change, as you can see here, and plan accentuates vertical change. I very, very rarely use plan because, as you can see, it has a certain spidery, almost like icy look that's very hard to pull off well, and most of the time it's not necessary. For extremely mountainous landscapes, I think it is, because it helps accentuate all those little goalies on a mountainside. But I always start with the profile curvature tool. It's a bit blurry. That's because I aggregated it to pull out those larger details. Otherwise, it gets very, very noisy very quickly. So I'm going to use the medium filter a couple times, smooth it. You absolutely never, ever, ever want, pixelation. So anything you can do that gets rid of pixelation, even if it makes things a little bit blurry, is always the best route to go. Because this is always uglier than this, in my personal experience. So we're going to take this, and you can use the multiply overlay on color blending, or linear burn, or soft light, or hard light. those are kind of the four that I use. Multiply, I think, is the best because it blends everything together without blowing anything out, like color burn, and linear burn sometimes can. Soft light is good if you really want to do a very, very fine touch. And then hard light picks out all the, it picks out all those little textures, which works well too. But I'm going to go with multiply. And it makes things obviously very dark, but that's easy to fix. We just open up our levels pane again, and we adjust the histogram. What I'm doing, and I should have covered this earlier maybe, is I'm doing two different things. I'm changing the overall brightness of the entire image here, but then I'm also kind of forcing the upper end of the spectrum more here, making kind of those brightest areas even brighter versus lowering the contrast of the entire image. And I tend to do both. Here, pull those shadows out a bit. I almost never touch the far left one because that makes shadows darker in a very extreme way, which I rarely want. So let's see what it looks like now. It's pretty good. It's still not. I think I blasted out those light areas. I'm going to do it again. All right, that's pretty good. It lost some of that height. And again, I'm doing this for the first time, so it's not going to be 100% right every step of the way. We're going to highlight those high altitude areas again. Blur it. Equalize this. Drop it down a bit. Call it. Then what I think I've still lost some of those really, really big terrain features, so I'm going to affectionately average the living hell out of this. Equalize it. Blur it. That's nice. That's a lot better. But it's a bit too extreme, so we're just going to tamp it down a bit. Yeah, look at that. That's starting to look good. All right. Let's start to paint in some of these finer details. Let's get our slope raster again. Oh, and you might see this sphere material normal one. That's a really interesting one, but I'm going to do that at the very, very end. It's kind of a final touch. And I'll explain it then too. Slope. We're going to take our curvature raster because I want to pick out those kind of nice, crisp, high mountain edges. So we're going to take a curvature raster and mask it with our slope raster and then flip it. So it's showing up in these steep areas. We're going to blur it because you always want to blur everything, but with masks you do because otherwise you're going to end up with weird lines from where the mask is aligned. But it'll show up in the end product. Median. Back to this. And boom, look at that. Shows up in those nice high mountain areas. Let's smooth it out a bit. A little more. Screen might be too much. I really like going for like a crinkly look. So I'm fine leaving things a bit crisper than they probably should be. Yeah. Let's get a bit more bang for our buck. Let's equalize this. So it goes from here to here. Yeah, that's nice. Drop this down a bit. Blend it in. Ooh, I actually like this. So this is inverted slope. This actually does a great job of separating the two, but it makes everything darker, which I'm not sure about. But it does accentuate those differences. So because I like the edges, but I don't like the darkness, I'm gonna high pass it. And I am going to do something like that. Let's see what happens when we invert it. Nope. See, it's a slight difference, but it kind of sets everything and gives everything sharper edges. All right. Let's get a bit weird here. Let's take our slope in again, and we're going to use the plan raster. Now this one's going to look horrifying if we use it as is. Yeah, disgusting. Way too much detail. Makes everything look like it's just frosted over. There we go. And we only wanted to hit those high mountain edges. So I like this, but it makes these foothills look a lot rockier than they probably should be. So I'm going to smooth this out a little bit. Apply my mask, but then I'm also going to mask it with my DEM. Bit too much. And it does a nice job of helping to pick out more details on those high mountain areas. It's getting a bit too crinkly. I'm just going to quickly run it over with a despeckle, blow it again, get back to here. All right, let's. I don't like how empty this is. This is one thing I really like doing. I like accentuating lowland areas as much as highland areas. So it's actually really straightforward to do this. You do the exact same thing, mask it with slope, but then you leave it as is. So it's showing up in just these flat areas. And then, because flat areas tend to have less gradation that can be easily picked up by a DEM, I will equalize the curvature raster. Basically see everything I have to work with. See, you can barely see all these little contours before I equalize it. I'm going to do it again. And then it's a bit too much as a get-go, but it's a nice proof of concept. Look at that. Paul just pops out everything up here. Really beautifully, but way too extra. So we're going to tamp it down. I always like to leave the opacity values as whole numbers. It's an organizational thing, but it also means you have to like iterate through multiple steps. It's easier to remember. Yeah. Put it again. So this is actually pretty nice. I like this already. Let's pop it out. Raise up the values a bit. There's Kanchenjunga. It's got some streaking on it, but not terrible. And it'll actually help it show through the imagery mosaic later. Now we're going to go on to sphere material normal 1. So if any of you are familiar with Charles Prepper now, he's a geographer formerly worked with National Geographic, but he worked out this really interesting technique and actually just put out a paper on it of generating normal maps. And if you are familiar with game design at all, normal maps are a way of kind of capturing um, how a surface reacts to light to kind of produce a faux 3D effect. And if you generate a normal map for a roster, you end up with really nice, sharp edges that you don't get normally. And you can do this with the aspect tool, but the aspect tends to, because it lives around from 0 to 360, at one point you're going to get edges that are too crisp in weird places. So this is much better. So I already generated this ahead of time. I did it in Photoshop, and he actually has an article on his website about how to do that. I'm gonna take my DEM, try it out first, see what happens. So I'm not sure which I like most. I actually kind of like reversing it. I think it looks better reversed. I think it captures different landforms. And if it was in the traditional arrangement, and this isn't heresy or anything, it's a big part of multi-dimensional, multi-directional hillshades. So I'm okay with it. Maybe let's actually do hard light and drop it down just a bit. Yeah, look at that. That's great. Oh yeah, you get the entire, like, you get this whole rise so beautifully brought out. All right. I think I could run it across one more time with the hillshade. Just want to get as much crispness as I can and try and accentuate those ridges. No. Well, that's fun. Just median it out. Blur it. Drop it back in and see what happens. Yeah, I like that. I like that a lot. Go back down to 50. Yeah, I think that's pretty good for doing it live.